guys, it's Thomas here, and today we're talking lighting for the low-tech planet build. Lighting's a really confusing topic for a lot of us. It's going to send us down a dark rabbit hole of confusing terms and jargon. It's also going to essentially give you a bunch of options, and you're not going to know which one's the best for you or if any of them are actually useful. And there's going to be a lot of terms you're going to come across that are going to be probably confusing or a little convoluted. So what I'm going to do is start with giving you some of these terms, explaining them in layman's terms so you really understand what you're looking at when you see these things written on a box. And I'm going to tell you what's important and what's not. So here we go. First off, lumens and lux. You're going to see these on bulbs a lot of the time or on the fixtures themselves. Lumens and lux describes the amount of light output that a bulb or a fixture is providing in the visual light spectrum, so light that we can see. What it doesn't tell you is whether or not any of that light is actually useful for plants to photosynthesize. It only tells you how bright a fixture is. So what's the point of having a really, really bright fixture if that light doesn't really help plants? It's not useful. That's the problem. So really we shouldn't focus on lumens or lux, although it can be useful information provided you know the fixture's good for growing plants. I would ignore it. Moving on. Next up we've got Kelvin, or color temperature, which is measured in Kelvin. Color temperature doesn't really tell us a ton about the actual spectrum of the light. What it does really tell us is how the light looks visually to our eyes. So when it comes to Kelvin rating, the lower the Kelvin rating, the warmer the white, or the warmer the light is going to look. And then the higher the Kelvin rating, so the higher the number is, then the cooler the light is going to look, or it's going to come across as a cooler white. So realistically, right around 6,000 to 6,700 Kelvin is what we call neutral white or daylight white or sunlight. So that's kind of what we're aiming for when we're looking at planted fixtures, even just from a visual perspective. The problem is I could take 10 different fixtures or bulbs that are claiming to be 6,000 Kelvin, and they will all look a little bit different, and they could all have slightly different spectrums. They may not actually be good for growing plants, but they should be somewhere in the ballpark. So Kelvin rating is good to pay attention to, but is not the only thing you need to worry about. And really, it's secondary. So we're going to tuck that one away as well. Just push it over here with lumens and lux, where we, say. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the most important terms. These are the ones that are most likely going to point you in the correct direction in picking a light fixture that's going to work really well for your planted aquarium. A really important term that you're going to come across is spectrum. Electromagnetic spectrum is the most accurate way to talk about or describe the composition or color of light. Light is comprised of electromagnetic radiation in the form of waves, which are measured in nanometers. So visual light starts somewhere around 400 nanometers, which is close to ultraviolet, and then goes all the way over to 700 nanometers, which is close to infrared. Using a spectrometer, we can measure light and have it displayed on a spectral graph for analysis. Next up, we've got PAR. PAR is the measurement of photosynthetically active radiation within the visible light spectrum that organisms can use for the process of photosynthesis. Which basically means it's the portion of light from a light source that plants are actually able to use for photosynthesis. So it's the useful part to the plants. The next term we've got is PIR, and it's very similar to PAR, but a little bit more confusing. PIR is photosynthetically usable radiation. So within the photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, individual organisms will want to use specific spectrums more effectively for photosynthesis. And for those plants, they may not be able to use the full PAR. So let's say we have a fixture that is 100 PAR, and then we have a plant that is able to use all of that PAR. All of that spectrum is perfect for that plant. So that plant is going to receive all of that PAR as PIR. So it's going to be 100 PIR. But we have another plant who can use all of that spectrum and has slightly different needs. Then that PAR level doesn't change. It's still a fixture providing 100 PAR, but the per level, which is more accurate, will go down. So for the other plant, let's say the per is only 80. So even though the fixture is providing 100 par, one plant's getting 100 per, and the other plant's getting 80 per, because they have different, very specific requirements. That's how detailed per is. The problem with it is it relies on a lot of extra data that we don't actually have for many of these organisms. It's very hard to acquire, and ultimately that makes per much, much more difficult for the average person to use. So even though a lot of people think per is going to be the be-all, end-all, most accurate thing, it has a lot more problems with application than it actually brings in usefulness. So for that reason, I kind of just push per aside. Bye-bye per. We're not going to talk about you. And we're going to stick with par, because par is definitely accurate enough for you to get a good fixture and calculate how much light you're actually giving your plants and what they're going to be able to use. Okay, so now that we understand the terms and we know what to look for and what to pay attention to, we can look at what kind of spectrum is going to be best for plants and what par levels we're actually looking for. So there are two photosynthetic peaks in the spectrum where plants photosynthesize most efficiently. The first peak on the blue end of the spectrum is around 440 nanometers, and it's responsible for vegetative growth. So that's the thickening of stems, the thickening of roots, broadening of leaves. It's going to be that compact, bushy growth. Plants that are receiving 440 nanometer light are going to be stout and really compact, but filled out looking. The next peak is around 660 nanometers, and is usually responsible for outward growth, stretching growth, leggy growth, where plants spread. It's also responsible for blooming. Because aquatic plants are underwater and water filters out red light pretty quickly, aquatic plants usually benefit from having a light that is heavier in the blue end of the spectrum. So you're going to want to find a light that's got a nice strong peak around 440 nanometers. Having a complementary peak around 660 nanometers as well is always great. It's not 100% necessary, but I do try to find a fixture that has that, because it does warm up the light a little bit. If your plants have reds in them, it's going to help bring that out. And obviously a little bit of outward growth is never a bad thing. So you might notice hydroponics lights will have blue and red LEDs, and that is exactly because of the two peaks I just told you about. But the problem is, a blurple colored light over top of your tank's going to look like garbage. It's not very attractive, which is why we look at Kelvin rating. So the Kelvin rating of between 6,000 to 6,700 K, like we mentioned, is going to be like natural sunlight or daylight, is visually attractive. So we're not only looking for a spectrum with those two peaks, but we also want to try to find a light that's going to be around that Kelvin rating for visual purposes. Lastly, you're going to want to look at the par data of the fixture. For most low-tech planted tanks, you're going to do okay if you've got a par between 30 to 60. But you got to keep in mind, all plants are different. While some plants may be okay under 30 par, other plants are going to need at least 100 par in order to do well. So that's something you have to consider during plant selection, but we'll talk more about that when it comes to selecting plants. What you really need to know is you're shooting for about 30 to 60 par, although that's widely debated. I think most research that you're going to do when you're out there on the interwebs is going to point to the 30 to 60 par range. So to recap, we want a Kelvin rating between 6,000 to 6,700 Kelvin. We want to look at the spectral graph of the light, and we want to see peaks in and around 440 nanometers and secondarily around 660 nanometers. And lastly, we're looking for a par between 30 to 60 at most. So with all that technical stuff out of the way, let's have a look at what fixture I picked out for that guy. So I'm going to be using the Current USA Satellite Plus. The spectrum is actually quite close to what I'm after. Although it lacks a true peak near 660 nanometers, it has a really strong peak near 440, and I am looking for more vegetative, strong, bushy growth in my low-tech planted tank, so that works really well. The fixture also states that it has 6,500 Kelvin white diodes, which would translate to a really nice crisp white, so it should be very visually appealing. And it also has controllable RGB LEDs that you can change the levels of to basically change the color of the fixture very slightly. So I can actually tune the way the fixture looks so it looks good to my eyes specifically, and I like that feature a lot. Current USA also shows data that the fixture is capable of achieving 85 par at 8 inches, which is more than I need. However, the fixture is dimmable, so with the use of my par meter, I can actually adjust it to get it exactly where I want it in the middle of that 30 to 60 par range, and I even have a little bit more to play with if I ever want to bump the fixture up, so that's really handy. The fixture is also sleek, thin, and has a great mounting arm that I picked up separately to mount it to the tank, so it's aesthetically pleasing and fits the bill that way as well. Lastly, the fixture is also quite energy efficient at only 18 watts. And while we're talking about watts, I'm going to take this moment to put a disclaimer out there in case some of you are still trying to use watts as a way to tell of how bright a fixture is. Wattage is not light output. It has very little to do with light output. Wattage is actually energy consumption. It tells you how much energy a device requires in order to work. So the watt per gallon rule, for a absolutely large, gigantic plethora of reasons, is no longer valid. We don't want to use the watt per gallon rule. It's an ancient relic, and it should be thrown on a shelf, left to get dusty and be alone, and Tomb Raider can find it one day and be like, wow, this is old and dusty, because it's garbage. So that's it. We've got light on the tank. We're one step closer to having a fully planted little low-tech planted aquarium. But before we can put plants in there, we need something to hold them down, because otherwise they'd be floating around a glass box aimlessly. So next episode is going to be on substrate. I'm going to talk about what kind of medium I'm going to use in the bottom of the tank and why. But before that comes, you've got an opportunity to talk to me in the comment section below. So if you have a comment or a question or anything, drop it down there. I'd love to get back to you. And don't forget to subscribe, because that's how you're going to see all the lovely shenanigans we get up to. We got a lot of cool stuff planned, not just this tank. And we've even got more Thomas Reacts videos coming out where I check out your aquariums, which has been so much fun. So stick around for those. And as always, keep on tanking, because you gotta. It's fun and relaxing, and it brings me joy, and I'm sure you enjoy it too. Spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum. This is going to be the hard part. Spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum. Spectrum. Need I say more? Probably, because otherwise I haven't really said anything.